Sure.
For posterity's sake, I want to welcome everyone to the Select Board and Housing Trust workshop on our housing efforts on Nantucket. This idea came out of several conversations that we felt the community could use a really well-rounded update on what we've been doing in the last number of years and where we're headed on the housing front. And while we recognize it's not the most opportune time of day for public participation, the challenges of accessing this room at various times of the day and having the resources to have a hybrid meeting of this type is challenging. So what I do know from past experience is that often the recordings of this type of session are viewed many times more than the folks who are able to participate at the time the meeting happens. So we forge ahead with the presentation in the hope that the community will review it later, and this will answer a lot of questions folks have about where we are in addressing what is generally recognized as one of the most significant issues facing our community today. So I want to welcome Rima Sherry from the Housing Trust. She's the Vice Chair of the Affordable Housing Trust. And of course, Tucker Holland, our Municipal Housing Director, Haley, our new Housing Administrator, and Ken Beaugrand as the real estate specialist from the town are the folks that really work hard at this every day and will present to you this breadth of information about where we are and where we're going on housing on Nantucket. So I will turn it over to Tucker.
Thank you, Brooke. And thanks everyone for being here today. The weather somewhat cooperated, so you're not missing too much in terms of sunshine, but we thought we would start out by showing actually a video that we created a few years ago around the housing issue, and really was at the starting point of generating some pretty significant financial support for the issue here on the island. So Maureen, you might show that.
So I will state that the reason we haven't called the meeting to order of the Select Board or the Housing Trust is we don't have a quorum of each board yet, either online or present. So should that happen, we may have to stop and call an official public meeting to order. But in the meantime, we'll just proceed. Thanks.
Can we go back to the start? Can we go to the start, sort of? Do we have volume? Charlie? Do we have a volume?
Bear with us. Hybrid meetings have their own special set of
Oh, it's just connected to it. Well,
You're hearing it, so you can narrate it.
I can.
Nantucket has changed since I roamed these halls. Did you know there's now more than 17,000 people living on Nantucket year-round? That's around 1,700 students.
Can anyone hear this? Not really.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week, our hospital provides critical health care for thousands of a community that supports local businesses. Like these people who have to deal with you before you've had your morning coffee.
Yeah. Okay, can we restart it?
Businesses who employ and serve seasonal. We value our history, the natural beauty that surrounds us. Yet the heart of our community lies in its people. It's our friends and neighbors who keep this island running, make it fun, and keep us coming back. Nantucket has changed since I roamed these halls. Did you know there's now more than 17,000 people living on Nantucket year-round? That's around 1,700 students in education, and about 250 educators and support personnel for all those students to teach them things like math and manners. But do we have enough stable and affordable housing for all those students and teachers? 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, our hospital provides critical health care for thousands of a community that supports local businesses. Like these people who have to deal with you before you've had your morning coffee. Businesses who employ and serve both seasonal and year-round residents. Can you imagine Nantucket without the people who keep us safe? Without our resources for wellness and mental health? The organizations that strengthen and preserve the legacy of our island's people. The housing problem on Nantucket is no laughing matter. If you're connected to this island, it's guaranteed you're going to know somebody who's been adversely affected by the lack of housing for our year-round community. These are the people that make Nantucket what it is, and they struggle to find, afford, and hold on to suitable year-round housing. The solution isn't easy, but there is one. We've done a great job in conserving our open space and our history. Now let's put that energy into preserving our greatest asset, our people.
Thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties. I hope that all of you could hear that. And as I said, it's a little dated, and I thank Chris for not pointing out that a brand new hospital has been built since that was filmed. But many of the themes obviously still are relevant today. So I wanted to thank everybody for being here. This is intended for a broad audience. I realize that you individually may have different aspects of the housing crisis that you're interested in, and so we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. I want to get you the answers that you came for today. This is, I'm going to say, somewhat of a informal approach in that if someone has a question as we're going through things, please raise your hand. I'm more than happy to pause on that. We've got about 30 slides to go through. I'm not planning to dwell on any one of them in particular, but I don't want to race past something that may be of interest to someone in the audience. So if we can put the presentation up. And can we go to full screen or? So I'll just start in here. I'm going to try to use as little jargon as possible today. It's a little challenging when it comes to talking about affordable housing, but there are a few key terms I thought if folks aren't familiar with, it may be worth spending a moment on. So you may hear me talk about the SHI list, which is short for the Subsidized Housing Inventory. And that is something that the state keeps track of for every municipality in the state. It, in effect, equates to how many homes do you have that the state would consider to be affordable, what the state would consider. DHCD is short for the Department of Housing and Community Development. They are really the state's housing agency and the arbiter of what we produce that counts toward that SHI number. The housing production plan is something that every municipality is required to have. Many do not have it. If you do have one, it provides many benefits. One, a roadmap to addressing your need. Two, it cuts in half a state requirement regarding safe harbor that we'll talk about next, relative to if you didn't have a housing production plan. And Nantucket currently has a housing production plan that is good until October 2027. So safe harbor relates to the state requirement that every municipality have 10% of its year-round housing stock qualify for that SHI list. If you do not have the 10% and you are not in what the state would call safe harbor, then you are subject to what is known as a 40B, Chapter 40B project. That is a development that can basically ignore local zoning and bylaws. So what safe harbor is it is good faith progress toward the 10%. The state recognizes that if you're at 2%, you can't go to 10% overnight. So if you are making good faith progress on the way to the 10%, they will give you periods of safe harbor, maximum 2 years. It's either 1 or 2 years. And what safe harbor affords a community is the ability to say no to a 40B proposal. Finally, AMI, or area median income, relates to what does the median household in that area earn. And Nantucket, as many of you know, is its own town and county, so it really only deals with us. So what is AMI on Nantucket? So currently, the 100% of area median income is a household of 4 earning $136,100 a year. When you talk about capital A affordable housing, and in effect what counts on that SHI list, you generally are talking about housing for folks who are earning 80% of area median income or less. That gross number varies by the household size, and you can see what it is in our case. So I touched on Chapter 40B a moment ago. Every municipality in the state is required to have 10% of its year-round housing stock qualify for the subsidized housing inventory. Presently, and we'll get into it in a moment, we are not at the 10% requirement, but we have been making good progress. So as well, it's useful if folks aren't familiar to understand the different nonprofit players that are at work here on Nantucket. There are obviously also for-profit developers who are contributing units that would count toward that SHI requirement and beyond in serving the year-round community. But the main players that we have here are, and I'm just going to go by order of when they were created, the Nantucket Housing Authority, that generally serves sort of the low and very low income level, Landmark House, which is geared toward seniors. Academy Hill has both market and income restricted units, again, geared toward the senior population. Housing Nantucket has 2 principal programs. One, affordable rentals, generally serving 100% area median income and less, as well as the Covenant program, which is a home ownership program that serves up to the 150% AMI level. And that is a program that really is a zoning relief program, so that if you own a property that otherwise would not meet the criteria for subdivision, if you are willing to create a covenant lot or a covenant home and subdivide in a 60-40 manner, you would be allowed to do that so long as you're putting it into this program and with this AMI restriction. Again, that's an ownership program. The Nantucket Education Trust is a nonprofit that was formed a number of years ago, really to serve specifically the needs of the school. And they have 12 units that they manage for school teachers and staff. Habitat for Humanity is a very active local organization, again, focused on home ownership, particularly at the 60 to 80% area median income level. Finally, there's the Affordable Housing Trust, and that provides for the creation and preservation of housing that is both low and moderate, and really in recent years has become the centralized funding source for housing creation here on Nantucket. So going back a few years, all of these entities would independently seek funding from different sources, our local community preservation committee and so forth. Now, in collaboration with the CPC, the town and others, the Affordable Housing Trust really has become the centralized point of funding, and therefore there is a coordinated effort across all of these different entities in how we're addressing the issue. It isn't to say there aren't other organizations that are also very interested and active in wanting to address this challenge, but these are the ones, the housing agencies that are sort of at the center of it. So if we go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, was there a question? Yes, sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Tucker, I was under the impression that the Academy Hill was privately owned, not a nonprofit, which is correct.
So technically, the town owns the land underneath Academy Hill, but it is being run by a for-profit private entity. You are correct, Julie.
All right. Thank you.
So if we go to the next slide, this, I'm sorry, Maureen. Oh, back one. Yeah, thank you. So these are the select board's strategic goals as laid out in their strategic plan for housing. They are, housing is really ranked, I'm going to say, as their number one priority within the strategic plan. And they started with the first three goals going back, I think, roughly 5 years. And over the course of the last few years have added goals 4 and 5 that are focused on trying to incentivize folks to rent to year-rounders, as well to create home ownership opportunities. And again, we'll talk a bit more about these in a moment. The number one goal on there, as you can see, is continuing in safe harbor on our way to reaching the 10% requirement. So as you can see, over time, we were relatively static relative to the 10% requirement. We were at 121 units for a period of time. And really in recent years, as this has come more into focus, voters have been, very supportive at town meeting and so forth. The select board has identified it as, a key issue confronting the island. Some significant progress has been made. So presently, our requirement for the 10% is to have 490 units. We have 297 on the list today. That number, the 490, is going to get reset. Following the 2020 census, the state will come up with a new determination of the number of year-round residences on the island. We don't know what that number is yet, even though the 2020 census is concluded. But we've been told more recently that in May of 2023, we will get our new requirement number. We don't know exactly what will happen. You might reasonably presume that our number actually could go down, having watched the video and noticed that there had been a reduction of 640 units of what was year-round housing, going over for other purposes. That was pre-pandemic. And as you all know, the pandemic in 2020 coincided with the taking of the US Census. So that could end up being somewhat of a perfect storm with regard to what our new requirement is, because obviously there were many more folks living here at the time of the US Census. Again, it's the state that determines it, but the US Census indicates that our number of occupied homes went up, by over 1,000 in 2020 relative to 2010. It's not a direct translation to year-round as far as the state goes, but we need to be cognizant that it could change. So if we look at, where we are at the 297 that I mentioned. We have been in a continuous period of safe harbor since 2019, and we have 193 units to go to reach that 490 requirement. So how do we get there? On the next slide, you can see how we do that. So there are several projects, and we'll talk a bit more in detail about them, that will contribute to getting to our 490 number. Six Fairgrounds, which is a 64-unit rental project that is slated to go next door to where we're sitting, next to the fire station, on roughly 3 acres, within local zoning, town meeting supported. It was appealed, and after going through the court process, it now is sort of cleared to go ahead. Again, we'll talk in a little more detail about that, but that's something that is very actively being worked on to solve a funding gap, and something that could be constructed within the next 2 years and folks living there. Finally. Yes, sir. Yes, yeah. Correct. So, some of them are and some of them aren't. Yep. So in the case of Six Fairgrounds, that's a for-profit developer that responded. There were multiple responses to an RFP that the town had issued. There were nonprofit and for-profit responders. It happened to be the for-profit developer that was awarded the project. And so what we're looking at is, well, to dive in a little bit, I guess, and because of the delay of the lawsuit, there is now a $10 million differential in the cost to construct that project. The developer thinks that it already has $18 million worth of subsidy from the state. The developer believes they can get an additional 4.5 from the state, but they're looking to us sort of for the balance. And so we said, the original deal was, we're going to put up the land, we'll bring the road and the utilities to the doorstep. Everything else is on you. We understand that the landscape has changed for everybody. This is the fastest way to 64 units of housing, which we very much need. It's within local zoning. So we're trying to find a way where we might make a loan to the project, but we're expecting that to be returned. Yeah. I'm sorry, yeah.
Excuse me, or if you want to come up to a mic, please.
Yes, thank you.
So the people at home will be able to hear the questions. Thank you.
So the question in that case was around, we had talked about nonprofit developers earlier, and we're starting to get into projects that involve for-profit developers and nonprofit developers. There was another question in the back.
So I just wanted to ask about those 64 units that on. Sorry? Oh, Victoria Ewing. Are they for sale or for rent was the first question. Is it only town employees that'll be focused on? And then when you say we are trying to subsidize it, I believe you ended with, is that the Affordable Housing Trust that's trying to subsidize that?
So in order, it's for rent. Of the 64 units, 55 will be income restricted at levels between 30% AMI, 60% AMI, and actually the largest chunk is for 120% AMI. There are a few market rate units by design by the select board when the RFP was originally issued, because they didn't want really any Nantucketer theoretically to be disqualified from being able to live there potentially over an income limitation. It's all year round, all rental. Is it for town employees only? No, it's not for town employees only. And I'm sorry, the third question was, it is the trust that, it's the trust really that has been, let's say, allocated the money, but the way that our Affordable Housing Trust works is that anything that the trust would like to do that involves over $100,000, which when we're talking about housing on Nantucket is pretty much everything, requires the select board to vote favorably on it. Yep. Oh, sorry. Yes, 100. So we're moving. So 103. So the Richmond Development Company is doing the project along Old South Road. There are 225 planned rental units as part of their permitting for that project, and presently they have completed 122 of those units with folks living in those units. So they have 103 units left to complete their planned project, all of which would count toward our 10% requirement.
And I'd like to just clarify that memorandum of understanding required that 25% of those 225 rental units be deed restricted at 80% AMI. Not all of them. There's often a misunderstanding of when people hear what the rents are at Richmond, that 75% of those units are market rate units. So I just wanted to clarify that. That has changed a little with some work that the trust has done with them, but in general, it was 1/4 of the units are deed restricted at 80%.
Right. So the additional project, and it just happens to total up to the 193, would be the 135, 137, 141 Orange Street property. So the trust acquired 135, 137 Orange Street a couple of years ago. We had been working with the Nantucket Land Bank on jointly acquiring 141 Orange Street. This is property that's located more or less across the street from Marine Home Center and Landmark House. And we felt that the 141 parcel was important, basically for better access and egress to the project onto Dave Street, so that not everything would have to go in and out of Orange Street. So we're very pleased to be able to work with the land bank on that. And now that that transaction has closed, and we've gotten a little more insight on the 10% number that we talked about a moment ago. Originally, we anticipated we would have the new 10% figure from the state this fall, and they more recently said, no, it's not going to be until next spring. So we're kind of saying, why wait? Let's just get going. Yes, Mary. Please.
Hi, my name is Mary Mack. I've heard over the years that some units, not these projects, but they don't count towards affordable housing when it seems like they logically should, if you know what I mean.
Yep. So I apologize, I've already gotten into the weeds. I apologize if I'm putting people to sleep with some of this, but the state gives a very heavy incentive to do rental in terms of meeting your 10% requirement. So if you do a rental project and 25% of the project is restricted at that affordable 80% level, 100% of the units count toward your 10% requirement. The rest of the units can be market or restricted at other levels, but as long as you have that 25%, 100% of the rental units count. When you're doing a home ownership project, take Sachem Path as an example. That's 40 units, all home ownership. There are 10 units that are at the 80% level. They all count toward the 10%. Anything above 80 doesn't count in ownership. So in Sachem's Path, there are 30 homes, some that are at 100% AMI, some that are 150%. None of those count toward the 10%. However, they're serving an extremely important function in our community. We need homes and rentals at a variety of income levels, and a slide coming up here will speak to that as well. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Similarly, just the covenant program at 150% AMI ownership, those would not count on the list, even though there are 108 covenant homes here on Nantucket today. So you can see there are several other, I'm sorry, do you mind going back for a second, Maureen? I flipped my page too early. You can see there are several other projects involving land that the trust has acquired in recent years, for the most part, in addition to some build out on the ownership side at the Richmond development. That's the Sandpiper 1 and Sandpiper 2. You know, someone might say, well, hey, actually, like, we're going beyond what the 10% requirement is here. And there are probably two good reasons for that. One is we need the housing. Number two, what I mentioned earlier, our number is likely to get reset to a higher level come the spring. So we're going to need to do more. No, I'm ready. Sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, Joanna.
Joanna Roach. Can you go back to the previous slide? I did. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, I'm Joanna, for those of you who don't know me. So I'm just thinking about these numbers and the deadline of, because you're using the 2020 census. So at what point will the numbers you're trying to project come into play? That's my first question.
So May of 2023.
May of 2023.
Yeah.
So in terms of Six Fairgrounds and Richmond Meadows, do you actually expect those numbers of units to be available by then? Because certainly 64 is not going to be constructed.
No.
So maybe under each of these areas, it might be good to say when you think the units will actually be available for the public, right? So, because there's a difference.
You're leading in.
Okay.
You're leading into a later slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a difference between what we're projecting and when the units become available.
For sure.
And there's a disconnect between understanding the relationship between those two things.
We're hoping to clear that up
Okay,
today.
good.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Nick
Hi.
Abbott. For the existing 297 units,
Yep.
Is there are any of those deed restrictions due to expire? And if they do, does that mean that they're taken off the SHI list, or once those are kind of in the bank, they don't really come offline?
It's a great question. So there are some units that potentially could expire, but there's, like, as an example, when Abrams Quarry was created, there was not the universal deed rider that exists today. But there's a mechanism in there where there's a mechanism to include it in the turnover to the next party, so that if it's not, the Affordable Housing Trust basically has a right of first refusal so that it ensures that it stays in the year-round family. So I would generally say that the probability is very low with regard to the units that we have on there. The one thing that I will point out, included in the 297, is our 15 units that are part of the Surfside Crossing project, and those are simply there because they're basically automatically, when you have a 40B project and the zoning board issues a permit, which they did for that project at 60 units, you basically automatically get credit at that moment for 25%, which have to be at 80% AMI. Technically, they're required to pull a building permit within 12 months in order for them to stay on. But so they're, in a sense, they're not really there, but they don't remove them unless somebody really pursues them on removing them. And, at some point, the presumption might be that something is going to happen there, and then they would actually go back on whatever the number was that it ended up being. Yeah.
Hi, Tucker. Just because Matt just walked in, we have a quorum now for the select board, so I'll call to order the select board meeting. Just a technicality. That way, Matt and Brooke and I could discuss or all say things. Thank you.
Thank you. So if we go on to the next slide, thank you. So this is just, it gives you a little bit of indication of where we stand relative to our peer towns on the Cape and Islands. The DHCD doesn't publish the SHI numbers for all communities every year. You can be individually updated, but so these numbers are based on the 2020 data that DHCD presently has published. So actually at that point, it showed we were at 4%. We today are at 6%. And so this is where we are, we're sort of maybe, slightly above average relative to some of the other communities. Obviously, we've been doing quite a bit in recent years. There are many, many communities across the Commonwealth that do not meet the 10% requirement. I mean, really, Provincetown is the only one close on this list. The statewide average actually is at 10%, but that's really because of communities like Boston that are at 20% and have 55,000 units that qualify on that list. So there's some skewing of the average in that regard. So, one of the questions that I guess we get asked less today than we used to, but, how do we know they're going to be people for all of these things that we're building? Well, these are just a few data points in terms of Housing Nantucket presently has 266 households on its ready to rent list. They have 99 households that are qualified for covenant homes. Landmark House has 160 people on their wait list. Richmond has over 500 households qualified for their remaining rental development, which is only 103 units. So, Habitat for Humanity recently had 67 applications for 3 units that they're creating for ownership. So, I mean, there's a lot of demand out there. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one clarifying point, particularly with the Richmond waiting list. Those are people who live on Nantucket already. 500 families who've applied, who've been qualified as Nantucket residents, who are actively seeking housing through Richmond. Yes, that the Richmond figure as presented to us is those are applicants who have been qualified as already living on Nantucket, who are actively seeking to rent an apartment at Richmond Great Point.
Yeah, so another concern that people have expressed, sort of, if we're building different things, are they going to be going to local people? So when you do a project such as Six Fairgrounds, you can apply to the state for what they call local preference. What that basically does is guarantee that 70% of the project will be locals, period. But the way that the process generally would work is if you had 100 applicants and you had 10 units, you could fill the 7 units with locals. So there are 3 units left. You are taking all of the locals who didn't get selected in that first round, plus the others, and drawing for those remaining 3. So it gets into, a probability game. And take Sachem's Path, for example. When that was 40 units, when that was created, there were roughly 200 applications for the 40 units. All of them but one was from a local family or household. And the one actually that wasn't, I understand, was from someone who used to live here who moved off because of housing and was trying to get back. So generally speaking, in theory, you could have someone who isn't here ending up with a unit, but in practicality, that isn't the way that it normally goes. Some people will point to when Maya Comet Village, which is the housing authority project, was originally created many years ago at a very different time. There were some challenges, I think, in filling at that time, and at that point, there were perhaps a number of folks who did come from off island to fill those particular units. And I think today people may argue and then integrate it into the community here, but today you're just not going to have the same issue in terms of the probability of it going to a local. Is it online? Yep.
Go ahead, Ella.
Oh, hello, Tucker and everybody. I just wanted to clarify one thing or 2 things, Tucker. Landmark House currently has a wait list of approximately 100, not 160.
Okay.
We did a little work on that. And also, we are entirely federally funded, so anybody from anywhere in the country can apply. However, and we do have many people on the wait list who are not from Nantucket. Most people have some connection to Nantucket, so they may be a parent, a mother-in-law, somebody living elsewhere in the country who would like to relocate to be closer to family. And in 6 years that I've been there, I've only had one person come from off island who had absolutely no connection to the island. So even though it's open to anybody in the country who qualifies, it's mostly populated by Nantucket residents.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you for clarifying that.
Sure thing.
So, so if we go to the next slide, so this slide captures some data that we recently collected from town employees. So a survey around housing was sent out to all roughly 730 town employees, really seeking housing information about their household. We received 366 responses, so about a 50% response rate. And this is really kind of a summary of where the household incomes that were, these are self-reported, came in. And as you can see, there's a great need at the, or I shouldn't say great need, but there's a significant number of folks who are at the federal affordable level in terms of that 80% AMI. There are a pretty significant number of folks who are above that 80% AMI level as well. And so that's partly where we're going to talk a bit more on, how our efforts are targeted. It's worth noting that 50% of those that did respond indicated that they were in what we call a housing cost burden situation. It's a federal definition, meaning that you're spending more than 30% of your gross income toward your housing cost. And 50% of those, or 25% of the total respondents, indicated they were in what's called an extreme housing cost burden situation, where they're spending 50% or more of their gross income toward their housing. So, where do we do the work that we're doing? The first place we kind of need to start is, where is it possible to do the work on Nantucket? So this slide, the colors with purple and green and yellow really indicate the conservation lands of one form or another on the island. So many of you may be familiar already that 53% of Nantucket is in conservation of one form or another. That's not including things like the airport and other similar tracts. So when you consider this map, and then you consider the next map, which is where is sewer and water on the island, you can understand why we really focus on areas that are served by town services and are also in proximity to employment and goods and services, grocery, post office, etc. So the things that have been happening and are happening around year-round housing, rental in particular, but also some ownership projects, fall into this zone. And we try at the trust to employ, given the parameters that we just covered, what we call a scattered site type of approach. So not one site trying to do everything, but multiple sites with some spacing and differentiation in neighborhood and so forth. You know, if you, in some ways, you may look at this map and say, you know, some of these are relatively close visually here, but you know, you're looking at something that spans 3 miles here. So things are not right next to each other in our view. You know, this is just sort of a quick summary. The things that are in red are things that you know, actually exist today. There are things that are in process, and there are some upcoming projects noticed or highlighted in green. Surfside Crossing, I had talked about a little bit before, is presently an appeal at the Housing Appeals Committee. The next slide. Town meeting, as mentioned before, has been, you know, very supportive of funding housing efforts here on the island. In recent years, there has been approximately 67 million appropriated toward projects, and you know, starting in 2019 with the Neighborhood First $20 million citizens article, simultaneously with a $5 million CPC bonding. We all know the pandemic hit in 2020, and so funding, let's say, resumed last year in 2021, and then there was some, you know, strong additional support in this current year. So these next few slides, I'm happy to spend time on any one of them. They're really, I'm going to have Maureen go through them in fairly quick succession, but these slides are part of a presentation that was given to the Finance Committee about where the money it was basically being spent and it intended to be spent, and what it would be producing in terms of number of units. And these are, again, articles from the years that we just discussed. Prior to that, funding, you know, for housing in Nantucket was relatively skinny. And, you know, a few years ago, the community woke up and said, you know, we really got to get serious about this endeavor. So this is a summary of the major funding allocations that tie into the map and the projects that we've been discussing here so far. You can see that in some cases we're subsidizing the land acquisition through a grant or through owning them ourselves as the Affordable Housing Trust. And then depending on the nature of the project, we are further subsidizing, we are anticipating further subsidizing, buying down the affordability of units, or providing project financing that actually would be in the form of a loan. So, you know, a good example of that is the 31 Fairgrounds Road project, a great collaboration between the Affordable Housing Trust, Housing Nantucket, and a local builder. And so that was 22 units that was going to be built no matter what. And the trust and the Housing Nantucket got involved and said, hey, if this is going to be built, it ought to be serving year-rounders. And so a certain portion was allocated toward a grant in order to acquire the land, and a certain portion was provided in really long-term financing to construct the project. You know, in addition, I talked to I talked a few moments ago about the Six Fairgrounds project next door here and how that project may end up requiring a $6.5 million loan in order to actually have that happen. We're not obligated to provide that financing under the agreement that we have with the developer. But, you know, if we went back to square one, it's taken us 5 years to get here. It's probably another 5 years if we're back at square one. So, you know, in total, you know, these bullet points address where is the money gone so far, or where is it intended to go. It has been important to have some flexibility around monies that have been appropriated in order to be able to capitalize on opportunities that have come along that serve the year-round housing need. And it's important to the trust work to have a little bit of flexibility when you consider some of these things that would have been unforeseen just 3 years ago. So I think hopefully this next slide is getting to the question that Joanna had brought up in terms of what is the timing for some of these projects that we're talking about here.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Tucker, we had a hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Julie. All right, we'll try her again later.
Can you unmute her? Or no? Oh, her hands. This is illustrating the anticipated timeline for some of these projects, again, that we've been speaking about with regard to Six Fairgrounds. We're, again, in the process of working out potential financing to allow that project to go forward, assuming that we can arrive at terms with the developer and with all of the other subordinate lenders who are involved. That hopefully would close in the spring of this coming year, and then it's roughly an 18-month construction period for that project. The trust is in the process, as I mentioned, with the acquisition of 141 Orange Street by the Land Bank and our participation in that. We are looking at a RFP for development of that site at our next meeting, actually next week, and hope to be rolling that out this fall. We are in the midst of construction at 31 Fairgrounds with Housing Nantucket. You can see 2 of the buildings already erected when you leave here today. And there are 6 more buildings that will comprise the 22 units that the next of which start arriving September 9th and will arrive over the course of the next 2 months. So really by the beginning of 2023, you know, we're anticipating occupancy at that development. Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh.
So I am Rima Sherry. I'm the vice chair of the Affordable Housing Trust, and I would like to convene our meeting for the trust because we do have a quorum online and in the room. Thanks.
So we have a couple of other smaller properties that we're also, we've been working on an RFP for 7 Amelia Drive, which is a small site where the new cut-through road between Waite Drive, the new road that will service Six Fairgrounds, and Amelia Drive exists. That's an opportunity for 2 or 3 units that would be, again, eligible for the SHI list. Could be home ownership or rental. Bartlett Road is a property we acquired last year, where we can create roughly 10 or 12 rental units in a neighborhood that is really largely year-round in nature. And Vesper Lane is the property that we acquired from the University of Massachusetts going back, I guess, a year, 2 years ago. It took a while for that transaction to ultimately happen. Given its proximity to land that the hospital owns and plans, I think, that they have generally for creating some housing for their purposes in that area, we're obviously wanting to coordinate closely with them on how that project develops. So we're, looking at moving forward with that one as well shortly. So, oh.
Go ahead, Peter.
Peter, are you unmuted?
I am unmuted.
There you go.
Tucker, I'm looking at the permitting. It looks like it's about 6 months for most of the projects.
Yeah.
Does the state get involved, or is there, given our community's desire to expedite these projects, if it's all local, might that be less than 6 months?
I certainly hope it could be less than 6 months, but to my knowledge, none of the items that are noted there would involve the state, with one possible small exception. But for the major projects, no.
Thank you.
So we've talked a lot about rental so far, some ownership projects, but there is without a doubt a significant need for providing home ownership opportunity, particularly above the 80% AMI level here. I know it's going to sound somewhat outrageous or hyperbolic, but if we want to have things like a police department or fire department or a school, and I can probably go on adding to that list, we need to have home ownership opportunity for year-rounders at a variety of income levels. And so, we kind of, are putting something out there that we really want to be creating 250 within the next 5 years. Maybe that's not the right number ultimately. Maybe it's greater, but we're at a juncture where we got to start to make some big headway. And there are things that can maybe help us do that. There is a vehicle called a community land trust that we have been investigating in terms of how it works in other communities and what it possibly could do here. We think it could be a real advantage for Nantucket to have one. The Vineyard has one in regard to the Island Housing Trust. And so that's something you're probably going to hear a little bit more about. But the fundamental description might be that, in a place like Nantucket, the dirt is a big component to owning a home here. And so if there is a way to take the cost of the dirt out of the equation for a homeowner, there are probably many folks who could qualify for owning the home and leasing the dirt through a long-term ground lease. And that's a model used in many places. Yeah.
I also want to emphasize that the community land trust model is really interesting from the perspective that it can be used to acquire existing homes. It's not all about building new homes. And so we have a lot of year-round families who've been here a long time, who are retiring, moving to Florida, wanting to sell the home they raised their family in or downsize. And so the community land trust model would allow the acquisition of those properties without that seller having to forego profit. I feel really strongly that it is not the responsibility of any individual property owner to take less money for their home than they would otherwise to solve our housing problem. However, if a land trust can co-acquire a property, taking the underlying land cost out of the equation for the next year-round owner, we can build a pool of properties that will be perpetually available only to people who live here. In a way, Matt likes to use the term bifurcated market. So we basically have two housing markets, that which is accessible to year-rounders only and that which is an open market. And I think I've seen this work in Guernsey Island, where I traveled a number of years ago, and it really inspired me as a way for community intervention in a housing market system. And so the combination of keeping homes that have been in the year-round community through the land trust is also part of the equation here. So, and it is potentially an opportunity for people to contribute philanthropically by donating to a nonprofit land trust, so that our seasonal homeowners of means can help solve with a tax-deductible donation. So that's kind of the model of that program. And I think we can make use of that really effectively here on Nantucket. So,
yeah, I mean, and we have a real example in a sense. Family, longtime seasonal family. The Birds approached us at the trust last year about selling some land that they have in the Surfside area, roughly 3 acres. It easily could have gone on the open market and commanded north of $2 million, but they were very tuned in to the year-round need here and came to us and said, we really would like this to go to you all and have it serve the year-round community. And we were very appreciative of that and asked if they were familiar with what Brooke was alluding to, a bargain sale, whereby they can get a tax benefit. They had acquired this property a number of years ago. There clearly was going to be large capital gains on it. And they went and talked to their trusted tax people. We can't give them advice in that regard, but they came back and said, in fact, we can sell it to you all for 1.2 million and basically still be as financially well off as if we had sold on the open market. So it's a great example of something that we hope might inspire others who want to help with the year-round effort.
And I could tell you that it has inspired others. One of the biggest changes, and I've mentioned this a couple of times in public meetings, is that the trust has been approached by longtime Nantucket property owners, year-round community members and seasonal community members, about giving the trust the opportunity to acquire a property before it goes on the open market. And that is an enormous, enormous change. That is it's a response to the example set by the Bird family, but also it's similar to the model that the conservation organizations have used, building relationships and communicating the need and inspiring people to come forward and at least investigate the option of whether it works for them financially, and whether it works for the trust's ultimate goals as well. So that to me is one of, beyond the voter support financially for housing initiatives in the last 4 or 5 years, that is one of the biggest changes I've seen in the landscape of housing on Nantucket is just the understanding in the community of the need and people's willingness to participate in the ways that they can.
Thanks, Brooke. So, the land trust can be a vehicle. The Affordable Housing Trust is also beginning to consider, a down payment assistance program. There are some challenges in doing that. We have a very successful closing cost assistance program. We've helped approximately 75 year-round families with their closing costs. It's a 0% up to $15,000 loan that, as we understand, both from the folks benefiting from it, but the financial institutions as well, it really, makes a difference in a significant way. So again, it's 0% interest, but it gets recycled once that property owner goes to sell. And we, in this last year, actually have started to see some of these recycle as people move into a new situation here. So we have some data that has helps direct us in how we target the makeup of different projects that we're doing. With everything that we do, we don't want to have a monolithic project at one income level, regardless of what it is. We're very much focused on having multiple income levels incorporated within the projects that we are involved with. And we half joke, but half, it's really a serious matter. But when the community started to get serious about this a few years ago, we said you could throw a dart, and as long as you hit the wall, like, you're doing something good. Like, more recently, we've been like, hey, we want to hit the actual dart board. Like, and, that's really a lot of what we're doing today. Where we're headed, is we really want to, understanding it's always a bit of a moving target, but we want to get even more precise about who exactly we're serving. So the town employee survey helps feed into that. There is a entity that called EPS that had done an economic impact study for Vail, Colorado, that the executive director of the Island Housing Trust and I, as well as the director of the Housing Assistance Corp in Cape Cod, have been in touch with about having them do a study for our area as well. And there are others, others that can provide useful data in terms of how we're targeting what we're doing. We kind of say, like, we can wait, but why? We have a huge issue, and at least in my own opinion, like, we can't afford to wait. We are losing year-rounders. It's starting to have an impact on the level of experience that people have who are coming to visit Nantucket, whether it's for a short-term period or they're here seasonally. And it obviously has all kinds of ripple effects on the the folks who have to live with housing insecurity and the organizations that they work for. So we think that there are, at least in I think that there are, there are greater roles for, continued town funding support. Again, this is, 67 million towards projects is material, but we're a long way from where we ultimately need to be. And there's no way to solve the problem in a place like Nantucket without subsidy. So we think there's a role, obviously, for the legislature, and we'll talk about that in a second. We're fortunate to have a very generous philanthropic community here. A number of folks, I think, are taking note of this issue and maybe starting to get involved in ways that they hadn't been before. And there's a question about what is the role for the conservation organizations here and how they might get involved in ways that they have not previously been involved. So I said there's a role for the legislature. Many of you are familiar with the work to get a transfer fee in support of housing. This is the 0.5% fee that will apply on amounts over 2 million. This is a home rule petition that Nantucket passed on multiple occasions, but first in 2016. We amended it this recent town meeting to serve up to the 240% area median income level that's commensurate with Aspen, Colorado, for example. Had it been in place last year, it would have generated over 5 million, and then those monies, in fact, could be used to bond, based on the history we know that the land bank has here. So we can have a very substantial pool of money to put to work, maybe particularly around home ownership opportunities, and then completing the projects that we talked about up there. Just as fact, the Massachusetts Association of Realtors has vigorously fought this measure. That's the reason it hasn't passed yet at the State House. There were consultants and lobbyists employed during this most recent session. The Vineyard, actually, all 6 towns on the Vineyard voted for a transfer fee this spring. They have had a full-time person solely focused on getting this passed, involved Laura Silber. I worked very closely with her. And despite significant effort going into getting a transfer fee passed this session, other communities want it at this stage: Boston, Concord, Somerville, Chatham, Provincetown, all 6 towns in the Vineyard, as I mentioned. It couldn't get through. Senator Sear had to withdraw his amendment to get our home rule tacked on to the economic development bill, and it just wasn't going to happen. However, he is close to the Healy folks, and under a new administration, he is optimistic about a transfer fee passing. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of other related items, not so focused on actual housing, creation or preservation, but somewhat things that are helping around the edges, like as we work on expanding our inventory. I talked about the closing cost program a moment ago. Nantucket Food, Fuel, and Rental Assistance does tremendous work. Janice and Tom, thank you for being here today. They have been they're there on an emergency basis, and correct me if I'm not saying that correct, Janice, but they have done some extremely important work particularly during the pandemic, to keep people housed. There is a town employee housing assistance pilot program that voters approved at town meeting this year. That's in the process of being deployed through the Community Foundation, trying to help those households of town employees that are the most extreme housing cost burdened. I don't know if there's any folks here today who are participating, wondering where do I go, or, are there things coming up shortly here or relatively shortly that I might want to reach out to someone about, get my name on a list, that sort of thing. Housing Nantucket actually is in the process of taking applications for a rental that they're going to have available at Okawa Ave, and those applications are available now and due October 4th. The project I mentioned across the street at 31 Fairgrounds Road also is slated to come online later this fall, early next year. So it's not too early to reach out to them as well about that project. Richmond Great Point, I believe everything they have built is filled at this juncture, but they are about to start a new phase of the project out there. Again, it's worth touching base with them at this stage, getting qualified. And similarly, Tacoma Green, again, while it's 2 years away from being in existence next door, that is something that is, beginning to come together. So I'd reach out on that as well. And Haley's number Haley's email is included here, and she's more than happy to connect you with the appropriate parties. Other folks may be sitting here wondering, how can I help address this problem? And there are a number of different ways folks can do that. If you happen to have a primary, secondary, accessory dwelling that is feasible to rent to a year-rounder during this crisis period, that certainly would be appreciated. I was with a hospital board member just shortly before this meeting, and he was mentioning, they have 50 open positions, really due to housing. You could consider creating a covenant lot, and the Affordable Housing Trust actually has instituted a program, again, in conjunction with Housing Nantucket, called the Covenant Formation Assistance Program, and that provides both technical expertise to help you go through the process, as well as some financing that is a short-term loan, until your lot or home is created, and then that is repaid, zero interest. But we've had several folks take advantage of that already. Yes.
I just want to add, as far as the covenant formation program, a lot of people aren't aware of a couple of things. First of all, creating a covenant lot on your property, which is not like, I live in a neighborhood where I can't subdivide, but if I were able to create a covenant house, it would provide me some cash flow in retirement to be able to stay in my home. The other thing that most people don't understand is within the covenant program, there's an exception on the qualification requirements for family members. So for instance, one could create a covenant house for one's child, even if they make more than 150% area median income. The income limit does not apply to a qualified family member. So if you're creating a covenant lot to sell to your child, or for instance, you could move into it yourself as a qualified family member and sell your main house and be able to stay. As long as it stays in the family, the income and asset restrictions don't apply until you sell outside your family, and then it becomes a standard covenant home. So those are some exceptions to the rules that a lot of folks don't understand, that create opportunities for downsizing, I think, particular for people of a certain age like myself, who are looking toward later years and not wanting to manage a larger home into my aging years. So some thoughts on that.
Thanks, Brooke. So I think we talked about it at the bargain sale type of opportunity that the Bird family engaged with the trust. If there are opportunities that others would like to make us aware of, we are more than happy to listen. folks can write the legislature in support of this transfer fee for housing. And I want to thank everyone who took the time in July as we were making a big push at the State House to write a letter. The former Secretary of Housing and Community Development in the Deval Patrick administration presently resides on the Vineyard now as a year-round resident, and he has been very active on the Vineyard with regard to the transfer fee effort at the State House. And he's a really fantastic individual, and in fact, used some of his political connection to try to advance our cause. And he said that in 25 years he'd never seen the quantity and quality of letters in such a short time frame delivered to leadership at the State House. So again, I just want to thank people who took the time to send something in. And finally, if to help, you can donate or volunteer your time with a local housing nonprofit. Share ideas. Please reach out to anyone on the trust, Haley, myself, Ken. Early in my career, I was in advertising and marketing, and the creative director said, a good idea can come from anywhere. So we don't have a monopoly. So with that, really, we've got about half an hour scheduled left for any questions that we haven't addressed so far. And thank you very much for your time and interest.
Hi, my name's Tony Robinson. I'm a new resident here. Back in November, we became year-round residents. We've definitely noticed stress on the local infrastructure, whether it's the crew that cleans out the storm drains in the winter or during any storm, even the one back in April, to the mail being delivered, to hospital workers that are now our friends who are now having to move off the island because she's been here for 13 years and can't find a place to live, to the recent fire, where we read the paper and we don't know whether we need 10 firemen or 100 firemen. And we certainly don't want our auxiliary firemen living in Hyannis. Right. At least that wouldn't be my first choice, living in the historic district. And so now it's become more of an issue from us as to this is really a public safety concern. Mm-hmm. We saw what happened in Providence with their whole septic systems and the entire town shutting down, right? We have old infrastructure. We new members of this town don't know how old that is or what we really need to do. But this is a different kind of community than even Vail, Colorado, which we spend a lot of time in Colorado. They don't have 15,000 going to 100,000. Mm-hmm. They have a level loading. And so the kind of stress on this community to ebb and flow, I'd like to know, do you get enough support for the basic infrastructure talent and staffing and management and operations of the town? And then if housing has to become one of their benefits that we need to offer people to come live here, then we all need to lock arms and say, we're going to help you do that. We certainly hear that from people in these different departments when I talk to them, because 3 days later in the storm, I'm out there digging out the storm drains and the guys come up and they say to us, sorry, we have no one here to help. We just can't cover the whole area. So we as residents need to understand, what do you need for staffing? Is it 10 or 100? And what are the barriers to getting that done? And we can't wait to 2024, at least I can't, and need to know that if you guys need us to whatever we need to do, they'll have a parade or something, but we need to get more people understanding. I think we hear from our summer resident friends that they think that government's too fat everywhere. We think they don't think that they really need any more government. They don't really think they need any more staffing. Whereas those of us that live here, we're really defending the fact that, my postal person can't come to our mailbox. Well, probably because they don't have enough people, but that's a problem. And so I guess I don't really have a question, but we need to figure out what the requirements are. What's the staffing requirements that you need to run this town? And then things like I can't get my dog groomed. I can't get a dentist appointment. Those are the secondary things. Those are important to me as a resident. Getting my lawn mowed, I can wait on that. But I definitely think that the crisis is, what do we need to run this town? And not having a fire station out in Sconset, I live in Easton Street. So what happens if they have 2 fires? So I'm just saying that the fire that happened for many of us was a big wake-up call. And we need to look at housing in a way that I think is a part of compensation, not something nice to have for the poor people. No. This is what we have. Well, that's what a lot of people think. It's thinking that we're just giving away housing. And we've had these conversations with people that are very educated and very worldly, but they don't have the facts of what we need to run this town, or at least I don't, to be able to defend what you guys are all doing. Anyway, so one other thing was brought up at a cocktail party. The Hamptons tax basis for their property taxes, I heard, is 7 or 8 times what Nantucket is. Now, there's a way to protect us all for the scaling of that, so not everybody has a huge tax bill immediately. But if we need to bring in more money, then everybody's got to contribute to that, because we don't want to become Provincetown, where we shut down in the middle of our best season with no septic systems or another fire. So that was
I will say is that the most recently elected select board members, you are asking the questions that I am asking. And I've had some conversations with people about what is the workforce that Nantucket needs, both in the public sector and private sector, to make our economy function. Economic analysis, I think, is what, to some extent, what Tucker was talking about with this group EPS that did some work over on the Vineyard. I think those are you've raised all kinds of good questions, and I would encourage everyone to attend select board meetings as often as possible, because the questions you're asking are bigger than a housing trust or housing questions. They're much more comprehensive and need to be addressed, and a lot of things get discussed at select board meetings along the line. And so paying attention as they go along is really helpful in keeping up on where those conversations are going.
It's only one thought that continues to come up again at the conversations I've had, whether it's the people that I met that are full-time residents here, or whether it's the off-islanders that come here for the summertime, is there's a lot of consultants that are being hired. And one criticism as a manager, and I spent all my career in the staffing and business modeling side of this, if you have a manager, whoever's running the department, they need to tell us what they need for staff, right? Our new fire chief needs to tell us, if you want to keep my fire, if you want to preserve our beautiful assets of this island, what do you need for staff? And if an outside consultant does that study and hands it to me as a manager, and I don't think I can deliver on that, then that's not a good accountability model, right? And we don't have a mayor, but we need to figure out who's accountable, right? So that if things do go wrong, we know where we can go to figure out how to rectify the situation. So I understand that we need the data, but I think we need to have all of our chiefs get in a room and have us tell them what do they need. And I guess the immediate burning question is between fire and police and the basic public service departments. Is there a way that we could get them all together and ask them, do you have the staff you need? And if you don't, how many open positions do you have? And what's keeping those positions open?
There is a lot of ongoing work in employee retention, in recruiting, and in compensation that's happening right now, analytical work. So there will be a lot more coming on this in short order.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure I mentioned during the presentation, but the median home price today in Nantucket is $2.8 million. So you have to be earning $530 some thousand a year to afford the median home here.
Hi again, Victoria Ewing. I just had a couple questions, and I might have answered some of them since I waited, but I was wondering why specifically the covenant program, I believe you mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't contribute to the 10%. And I was thinking, is it because it's based on the 150% AMI? Okay.
We've tried to argue with the state that it should count, but yeah.
I have a expediting company for 17 years on the island, and I generally constantly encourage people to look into the covenant program, try and create more. And I personally have been trying to buy one for 3 years, and it's a brutal process.
Yeah.
And the Housing Trust has been wonderful to me as well. I've applied and qualified. It just seems counterproductive possibly to encourage people to do it. They may be really wanting to contribute to that 10% result, and then why would they do a covenant, even though there's other opportunities? Are they two paths basically for local solutions?
Yeah, I mean, in order to qualify in the subsidized housing inventory, you don't get to choose who you sell to or who your neighbor will be. It's a lottery system.
Right.
So a lot of people would be uncomfortable with that, particularly in a house that's proximate, right? Not knowing, whereas with the covenant program, it's an open market and you can sell to anyone. That's largely the one of the reasons why there are two different paths.
Got it.
It's a deed restricted home ownership that is like this separate sort of open market in a limited basis.
Yes.
Whereas the shy list housing has you have to hire a lottery agent and you have to follow very strict lottery rules. So it's really hard to do as an individual homeowner as well.
Yeah, I've applied for them. I know the work that goes into that. And then and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we just approved the new tertiary covenant subdivision at town meeting. So at this past May. So I assume that has to go to the Attorney General still, and it'll be like a secondary covenant opportunity for people to subdivide. Is that right?
So tertiary dwellings are different from that. Tertiary dwellings have been around for quite some time. The tertiary program has been utilized by a lot of property owners who had dwellings that were basically occupied as residences, but were studios.
Yep.
And they've brought them into compliance as tertiary dwellings or created a third home. And the general rule in the tertiary is one of the three buildings on the property has to be occupied year round by somebody. The thing you're referring to is a covenant bonus lot. So particularly on larger lots that are not subdividable because they're in Lug 3 or large zoning, what's been allowed is a second bonus covenant. So in other words, 3 dwellings, but 2 of them can be completely independent in ownership as 2 covenant lots on those lots.
And that latter still has to go to the Attorney General and be approved and go through that whole process right now?
Let's get back to you on where that stands. I don't know the answer unless you know, Tucker, whether it's.
I don't know the status with the Attorney
we'll find
General.
out.
Yeah.
But it's basically another covenant lot then. It's not specifically a tertiary covenant lot. It's a secondary covenant opportunity lot.
Correct. It's a bonus. I would refer to it as a bonus covenant. So 2 covenants and a main house on a non-subdividable.
Okay.
Otherwise
And then
non-subdividable.
lastly, with all this said, will the proposed 250 new homeowner opportunities that you guys mentioned in one of your slides also not qualify towards the 10%?
Some of them would.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the idea is that the state requirement, has really strict rules around it. And we know the need extends far beyond the parameters that they're targeting in that program.
Yeah.
So the idea is we've been focused on safe harbor and building our way toward the 10% to open the doors to meet the needs of a broader cross section of the community in terms of income level, because we know that folks, even at the 200% AMI level, when you look at a banker qualifying them for a mortgage at our median home price, they can't afford a house either, even though they're doing extremely well by America standards of America in terms of income.
Yeah,
we need it across the board. Yep, we need
I've
it
had
across
to,
the
as
board.
a single income owner, trying to qualify for $1 million. It's very difficult.
Yes, impossible. And so, down payment assistance could be one way
That would be huge.
that we help with an additional down payment, which gets you to a mortgage that you can qualify for.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff, but anything we do with municipal funds has to have a deed restriction of sorts. So I think that's a challenge for some people to accept that the help comes with restrictions attached.
Yeah.
And, those trade-offs and helping communicate how that works.
So yeah, just to build on what you said there, the buckets of money that have been made available all have their own sort of individual restrictions associated with them. So for example, anything that we create with money from the Community Preservation Committee, there's $10 million of bonding up there. That all has to create units that are at 100% AMI or less maximum. The original Neighborhood First, is it's sort of known locally, the $20 million in 2019, the first real big injection of funding toward addressing the housing issue here, that originally was intended to create 1 year of safe harbor and in effect 24 units. The requirement with it is that everything that money produces must qualify on the subsidized housing inventory. So again, that's why it really was geared
Spread
toward
out to
rental.
all the different projects. Yeah. And then lastly, was it the Community Land Trust? Is that what you guys are considering that was on one of the slides?
Yes.
Would that be a deed restriction as well if people are asking about it?
But for sure a deed restriction, not necessarily all subsidized housing inventory eligible, but
Right.
100% year-round only.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in perpetuity in theory, right?
Okay.
So that when it sells to another year-rounder. Those are the kind of restrictions we're talking about.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah. We have an online question.
Go ahead.
Is
Greg.
it me?
It's you.
Okay. First, I just want to say thanks to everyone for putting this together. This has been really educational. It answered a lot of questions that I've had, but ultimately it doesn't answer the big picture question, and I'm not sure it's an answerable one. But we all know what the doomsday scenario looks like if we don't solve the housing crisis. But what does it look like if we do solve the housing crisis? We're adding a lot of housing to the inventory, but that means we're also adding more people to the island, and more people often means a decrease in water quality. It means an increase in traffic. So can you give me a sense of what the island looks like when it reaches some kind of equilibrium, where we have that bifurcated housing market that Matt Fee talks about, when we have some kind of predictable future, because we've had a lot of chaos in the last 25 years. Is that an answerable question for you folks?
I think it reflects some of the comments from, and I can't remember your name, but Grant, I don't know whether you were on earlier, but when we looked at the demand numbers, the demand is from people who are already here. It's not people moving here. We are so far behind in meeting the need of the people who are already living here, working here, fulfilling roles that are critical to the community. But I do not want to discount your question. When I think about a vision for Nantucket, I think about housing sustainability and balance as a critical part of where we go. And this analysis of, how many people does it take to populate the staffs of our important island businesses, nonprofits, hospitals, schools, the town itself? And is there a rough ratio of housing for people who live and work here and want to stay here in their retirement years versus folks who come as part of our seasonal visitor community, which is critical to our economy? And how do we analyze that, and how do we determine what that ratio or balance in housing is? I'm pretty sure in my mind 10% is not the number. There are communities in the mountain communities who are targeting 30% and north of 30%, and they're still struggling to house their needed workforce. So What does Nantucket look like as a thriving, sustainable year-round community that supports a thriving and sustainable seasonal economy? And I think as a select board member, those are the questions that I am asking. I want to do better analytics on, and I think we can do more future thinking than it's possible to do more and be less reactive and more proactive going, in general about what our future looks like. Tough questions to answer, and I can't give them to you today, but I can commit to being very interested in figuring it out.
Hi, I also like to thank you, Kathy Baird, and I wanted to thank you for the work here today. It was very interesting. And I just have two short questions. One is, in the map you had, which showed that most of the focus on the affordable housing initiatives are in the centrally located areas where there are services. I know that I'm pretty sure there are lots all around the island that are affordable housing lots that really don't fit that profile. So the first question is, do you have plans for those? Would you sell them, or can you sell them to use that money to foster other things that are centrally located? For example, I know there's one in Tom Nevers. We have no sewers, we have no water, we have no bike path, we have no wave, so that kind of thing. That's one question. The second question is, seeing all of the affordable housing initiatives that the town is involved in, the hospital is involved in, is there any group that's kind of coalesced to serve the restaurant industry or other businesses on the island, or are they kind of all on their own and trying to find housing for their workers? So those are the two questions.
Well,
I could speak to the question of dispersion. I think that when we look at the master plan for Nantucket, that centralizing folks where access is available and town infrastructure is available, but that doesn't preclude the possibility of developing housing for year-rounders in areas that are farther out, like Time Nevers. And I think the Covenant program is a good example of that. There is obviously additional cost to developing housing opportunities that rely on septic and well. So there's an actual cost per unit that plays into that calculus as well. And I think as we move more into home ownership opportunities, we're going to see year-round housing spread out more around Nantucket from that point of view. And your second question was about restaurants.
General businesses.
So, and I think you're probably talking a lot about seasonal workforce in that regard, as well as year-round. More and more businesses are finding that because of the housing crisis, they are investing in housing for their employees as just a need for the business. I have concern about what's the future for us if you can't start a new business unless you can afford housing for your staff. And as far as I know, there's no concerted effort within any industry to solve this as a group.
Okay, that's really what I was at,
Yeah.
Not just restaurant or any other, just in general, the industry that exists on the island that supports the tourist economy or the seasonal economy. It just seems to me that there's a great big group of people that could benefit, and if there was a program that the trust, was for them, not just the hospital or other people, maybe that would help.
So I'm very pleased that Peter's here today from the chamber, because that's really like a group that represents the folks that I think you're largely talking about. And, Peter's relatively new to this role, and he's going to say a few words, but, welcome the engagement of the chamber on this topic.
Peter Burke with the Chamber of Commerce. Yes, obviously it's an issue that we've identified. A lot of the businesses have approached us and said, "Hey, do you have any ideas where we can stack people into houses?" And unfortunately, it gets a little tricky where we can't really play mediator officially. We are trying to develop a response to that for the restaurants. Say, "Hey, look, this is," or restaurants are the the biggest player in terms of where people see visibly, hey, restaurants are changing their hours because their staff is short staffed and all that. So we're really doing our best to right now is listen and figure out, first let's identify the issue and where we can help. We haven't come up with the answer yet. We're obviously to the group here as well, we're open to suggestions. I think the first step is really taking a page out of this team's playbook and asking. I think the first thing is just to say, hey, look, if you do have a secondary dwelling and you don't feel it's appropriate to sell it, would you consider renting it, and approaching restaurants directly, restaurants and retailers as well. So we're trying to come up with an organized, at least, method and a streamlined communication for that. But it's a tricky issue, and we welcome all any ideas. Thank you.
I also want to comment on employee housing generally as a policy. I remember when I was in school, we learned about company towns in the old mining industry, and I worry that my dream is that we have enough supply of housing for the workforce that we need, so people have the freedom to change jobs without becoming homeless. And I've seen this concern expressed both by employees and by employers that you're in the business of running a restaurant. Being a landlord is not necessarily something you ever wanted to do, especially a landlord to your employees. And I think that having an adequate supply of housing for our workforce means that people have the opportunity to move from one employer to the next without losing their housing. And that, to me, is the long-term goal. And I think it's the most sustainable model as a community that we would have. And so increasing the supply of deed-restricted housing that's available to people who live and work here is the best way to achieve that. In the interim, businesses are having to solve this problem on their own by acquiring property, but I'm not sure in the long run that that's the best model for either the employer or the employee in the long run.
So I just wanted to clarify one thing with regard to the question earlier about studies. And so the type of study that EPS, for example, could do, is really relative to what Brooke said there regarding, what does it take to have a sustainable community housing wise, and what is the economic impact of not having certain things. It is not, I just want to be clear, it is not going to say you need so many firemen. That I completely agree with you. That is the fire chief's job to come up with that figure.
Right. Yeah. I'm Matt Fee. I own Something Natural, and I've been housing people for 40 years, 45 years. If you don't have housing, you don't have a business anymore. And the ones that are successfully still operating, Reese Trucking and others have done that. And, Toscana and a bunch of other businesses, trying to add more to the island right now, add more businesses and grow, doesn't make any sense to me. I think it's short-sighted because we don't have the infrastructure, mainly housing, in place to do that. Restaurants are not closing because they aren't profitable. They're closing because there's nobody to work, and I think, and they're the most visible, but the same thing is happening with landscapers. It's happening with painters. People are, the data project numbers that came out, there's, 20,000 more people and the same or fewer employees available to work. And so I think Brooke is correct, but I think we're not going to get to those numbers for a long time. And so, you're not going to get to 30 or 40%. The mountain towns don't look at 10% of the year-round population, 400. They're looking at 30 or 40% of their total population. So they're looking at trying to do 40% of Nantucket. What would that be? 4,000, 5,000 homes? That's what they're targeting. We're miles off of where we need to be. I think the businesses that are sort of handling it the best they can, they understand that there's going to be a certain amount of people leaving. You're going to have people that are going to be willing to be in employee housing for, sort of group housing for a number of years. They might be willing to go to an apartment for a while. Maybe they can go to an apartment with a room for their child when they have a family, but then they're gone. And I think some of that has to be planned into the model until you actually get the other houses. So when the town is thinking about it, I think the town has to think about, okay, we have so many at this level we need, starting employees. We have so many at this level. We need so many here. You have to sort of have a range of them. The idea of, it sort of goes to grants and it goes to Kathy's question is, well, why can't we just do this everywhere? We'll just subdivide everything. Well, if we subdivide all the lots to turn them into, more dense housing, but we haven't done it with thought or with, sort of, we have town and country. We should follow town and country. If we don't follow that, if every house represents about 2.3 cars, everyone built, they might not be in that driveway, but they're somewhere else. So if we build our housing car dependent with no sidewalks and no way to get anywhere, we are going to, that is going to be sort of the Death Star. That's going to be the worst thing we could do. But if we actually make dense places like this property is supposed to be, that was the original intent of Fairgrounds. If we make dense places that any of us would want to live in, make the housing great, make it a really great place, then people would be happy to live there. It would work, whether they own it or not. And so I think we have to look at things sort of differently than we have. We can't build suburbia, with wide open spaces and think that we're going to get there. It's going to have to be a change. And I think what we should be following is the patterns downtown. We should be connecting streets and making more density, but making it in the historic pattern. And when we give a landowner the increased density, they get 6 lots instead of 2 or something. A percentage of that, it should have standards on it, and a percentage of that should be required to be at least year round. And so I think those are the things that we haven't quite got to yet, but we need to be sort of fleshing out and getting to. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Great. I just had one sidebar, somewhat creative thought. I don't know if it'll work, but I think the right players are here to throw it out there, whether it was an AHT thing or a town thing, with the upcoming licensing and permitting that'll be required for short-term rentals, and the work group for that coming into order right about now, I believe. I think there's enough houses that won't get it together. And with you needing another 2-3 years of development possibly on some of these projects, maybe there's an incentive for the people that don't get their licensing in order, that are short-term rental owners, whether they're off-island, on-island, locals, or otherwise. If there was an incentive for them to maybe offer the next 2-3 years to get us through to this space where we have this development done, and they would maybe take, maybe a break in cost, maybe not. But maybe that's a thought to put out there for whether it's, like I said, any of the groups involved and around.
Yeah, and I think that the $1 million for town staff support is in part to help support, that kind of subsidy through the employee. But the challenge, as I understand it, from a tax-based point of view, is our tax rate's pretty low and the income potential is pretty high. And so in terms of dollar for dollar financial incentive, it's pretty hard to match that.
Right.
However, other communities on the Cape have done it and successfully offered relatively, one would think, low compensation to incentivize people to rent to year-rounders instead of on a seasonal basis. And so it is definitely in the hopper of thinking about how that might happen as well.
Great.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to maybe comment for a second on, we talked about timetable there. So, unfortunately, there isn't a magic wand, that comes with the housing director position so that you can just, boom, create it. There is? Oh, no, nobody issued that to me. But if you think about the, some of the projects that actually, have occurred here, Sachem's Path, from start to finish, that was roughly a dozen years for that to be created. It's 40 units. You take a private development, Beach Plum Village, another 40-unit project, a 40B project actually, start to finish was probably about 14 years. Like Richmond development has been definitely making some headway in recent years, but that, we're 7 years into it. So, we're 3 years in here. You know, we have had a pandemic in there, which didn't exactly help with being able to move forward with construction projects. But you know, in a relatively short time frame in the housing world, I think we can. You know, we're making some good progress. Yes.
Jennifer Costanzo, I just wanted to point out that, you know, with complicated issues such as housing, it's not a simple process to solve, obviously. And, you know, I was not, you know, aware of this until I became involved in housing, because I thought, well, we need housing, you build a house. Unfortunately, the solution obviously is not that simple. So I just really wanted to say, you know, thank you for all the people that have been working, you know, tirelessly, ever-sitly, and financially to help, you know, solve this, you know, multi-pronged, you know, issue that we have on Nantucket. I am glad to know that more people are becoming aware, because when you do become aware and it affects you personally, then, you know, more solutions can, you know, be risen to the table, as we've seen, you know, with a person who is a summer resident and it affects them in a different way, which it would affect, you know, a year-round single mom who's really trying to provide housing. But housing, you know, is a basic need for all of us. And I do think that it should be provided for those who do need it, who provide, you know, adequate, sustainable services so we can have a healthy community. But obviously it's going to take time and effort and a lot of patience. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks for all the work that you and Habitat do.
Is there any questions?
Are there any more questions in the room? I don't think we have any more online. Well, if there aren't, I just want to thank everybody again for being here today, for your questions, your interest, and we appreciate you taking time out of what otherwise probably is a busy day to be here. Our contact information is in the deck. This will be on the town website following the meeting. And please reach out at any time. We're here to answer questions, to take your ideas, to work together to help solve what is really the most pressing issue confronting the island.
Yeah, and I'll close by saying I will talk to anybody about housing all day, any day, as I've been doing. To me, it's the number one reason why I ran for the select board. And what I want to acknowledge is, you know, the timelines that Tucker talked about some of these projects and how long they took to create. What has changed is the acknowledgement in the community of how critical solving this problem is. I think that there has been a huge change in the conversation around the level of the crisis, the need to resolve it, creativity around resolving it. And in the 5.5 years that I've been actively involved in this effort, it's a completely different conversation in a good way. And it's been a completely different experience going to town meeting and getting the support without a lot of pushback. And I think that the more we talk about it in our day-to-day lives and the more we build consensus around building the momentum and investing in solving this problem as a community, that it is ours to solve together, and that there are compromises that need to be made to achieve that goal, the sooner it will happen. And I am encouraged by how much it's changed in 5 years, and I really look forward to the momentum building in us and us really getting to address this in a significant way in very relatively short order compared to some of the timelines that Tucker just talked about. Thank you all for coming, and please share the YouTube video link when it comes up online with all your friends and tell them hopefully how helpful it was to be here today and get this comprehensive overview of housing on Nantucket. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Like a pro.